Chicago drill music and the gangs that young Chicago rappers affiliate themselves with tend to have long and storied histories. The Black Disciples and the Gangster Disciples that the likes of King Von and FBG Duck belonged to respectively also had a long history themselves. The BDs and the GDs folklore dates all the way back to the 60s, when the likes of Larry Hoover and David Barksdale fought for influence over the city's drug trade and thousands of young men looking for guidance in the most troubled areas of Chicago, and unfortunately leaving countless bodies in their wake. But when it comes to today's Eastside-based No Limit gang, the modern-day rappers and gangsters that rep No Limit actually descended from another Chicago street gang with a very long and complicated history too. In this case, it's the Black P Stones.
In the 60s, the biggest, baddest gang of all was the Blackstone Rangers. One of its organizers was a skinny kid from Aberdeen, Mississippi, an unlikely-looking leader by the name of Jeff Fort.
Originally known as the Blackstone Rangers, this was a street gang formed by young black men who lived around 66th Place and Blackstone Avenue in Chicago's South Side. This crew was apparently formed all the way back in 1959 at the St. Charles Institution for Troubled Youth by Eugene the Bull Hairston and Jeff the Angel Fort. And like many of the famous street gangs that we know today, the Blackstone Rangers originally formed to protect its members from the danger of the many other street gangs that were emerging in the streets of Chicago around the time.
Racial change, economic change, cultural change, they grew out of that turmoil.
One particular rival that the Blackstone Rangers had formed to protect themselves against were the Devil's Disciples from nearby Kenwood, not to be confused with the biker gang of the same name. Back and forth street battles between these two crews persisted throughout the 60s, by which point an estimated 200 people had joined the Blackstone Rangers, giving not only the rival gangs something to worry about, but also the local police.
Had you as a police officer ever seen anything like that before?
No. Never.
Eugene Hairston was the founder and leader of the Blackstone Rangers, going by the nickname Bull, with Jeff Fort his vice president and second in command, with him going by the monikers Black Prince or Angel, the latter apparently coming from his gift for diplomacy and an ability to help squash conflicts between the Rangers and other gangs. In fact, unlike the modern-day gangs of Chicago, who seem primarily concerned with settling scores and murdering rivals, back then Jeff Fort's talent for diplomacy were deployed in an effort to prevent the Blackstone Rangers from going to war and killing other gangs, with Jeff Fort instead attempting to forge alliances between these small and fractured street crews. And he was very successful at this, eventually forming a sprawling alliance or nation of gangs, counting a total membership in 1969 to be as many as 8,000 members, and forming a council of numerous gangs aiming to control the city, going by the title the Main 21.
21 gangs would join under the umbrella of the Blackstone Rangers. There would be a ruling council called the Main 21 and a new gang name, the Black P Stone Nation. Some would argue the P stood for power. The nation was 4,000 strong. There were some struggles over leadership, but in the end, it was Jeff Fort who emerged as the man in charge.
All the gangs were united under the banner of the Black P Stone Nation, or BPSN. Each gang in the nation were considered a brick in the pyramid, hence their infamous logo. And for a period starting in the late 60s, the organization actually gained political legitimacy, famously working with a local community association that had been given a $1 million grant, developing a program that aimed to get members of the Blackstone Rangers and the Devil's Disciples into honest work and employment programs. During this time publicly, the Black P Stones were beginning to look a lot more like a group of community activists than an active street gang. For example, some in politics around this time had praised the P Stones for having played a role in preventing violent reprisals from the black community in the wake of the Martin Luther King assassination. This had politicians at the time praising Jeff Fort for his successful gang diplomacy, with Fort even being invited to President Nixon's inauguration, leading many to believe that Jeff Fort might just have a bright future in politics. But under the surface, things were perhaps slightly more sinister. It was said that during this period, Black P Stones had been shaking down local store owners for protection money in exchange for preventing violence following the Martin Luther King assassination, with critics of the Black P Stones describing them more as a mafiosa-style protection racket than group of community activists. And from here, soon cracks would begin to emerge in the public persona of the Black P Stones. On the streets, they were at war with the Disciple Nation and Gangster Nation that would later merge into the Black and Gangster Disciple gangs, made famous in modern-day drill music. In fact, as a result of this violent conflict playing out on the streets, eventually the Black P Stones leader and founder, Eugene Bull Hairston, would arrange an assassination attempt on Black Disciples founder David Barksdale, aka King David, in 1968. The shooting of King David would be carried out by a group of 14-year-old P-Stone members who would attempt to assassinate David Barksdale armed with M14 rifles in a contract killing being paid only a sum of $1 each. King David would initially survive this assassination attempt, but unfortunately his gunshot injuries would later claim his life around 6 years after the shooting. Eventually the authorities would crack down on the Black P-Stones as a political organization, prosecuting Jeff Fort himself for misusing federal funds in connection to the job training program made possible by the city's $1 million grant. This was a move which some considered simply a right-wing attack on Black Chicago's attempt to bring about legitimate change through politics.
We were trying to do something about a situation that was literally destroying this community.
With many pointing out that only a fraction of that $1 million grant ended up in the hands of the P-Stones, but that simply didn't matter when the headlines read, "Gang leader steals $1 million from the US government." Jeff Fort would later be found guilty of conspiring to misapply federal funds, being sentenced to 5 years in prison. During his time in jail, Jeff Fort would convert to Islam, more specifically the Black Muslim organization, the Moorish Science Temple of America. And upon being freed in 1976, Fort would form the El Rukn tribe of the Moorish Science Temple, with El Rukn translating to the Pillar in Arabic, and coming up with a new nickname, swapping out the formerly diplomatic title of the Angel, now referring to himself as Chief Malik, or the Ruler. And in the process of establishing his new religious organization, Jeff Fort also purchased an old vacant movie theater called the Oakwood on the corner of 39th and Drexel. This would become the legitimate headquarters for the El Rukn, and the religious transformation of the Black P-Stones was presented to the public as a positive change for the group. However, local authorities thought otherwise, insisting that Jeff Fort's new religious organization was simply a front for a large drug dealing operation that would operate throughout Chicago through the 70s and 80s. And during this time, Jeff Fort organized yet another alliance of gangs in the city and prisons known as the People Nation, bringing the likes of the former Black P-Stones, the Latin Kings, Mickey Cobras, Vice Lords, and other gangs all together under the banner of the People Nation. I mean, despite the negativity that he brought to his community, you do really have to admire the vision that Jeff Fort had to try and bring this many people together in his community. And perhaps people were truly right when they said he had a lot of potential in real politics. But the reality was, Jeff Fort was playing with fire, and eventually the authorities would crack down on his operation. A 1983 drug bust, in connection to a large shipment of drugs in Mississippi, earned Jeff Fort a 13-year sentence for narcotics trafficking. But from here, even in prison, it would appear as if Jeff Fort kept a tight grip on the large organization of gangs that he had built up in the streets of Chicago. And this meant that even behind bars, bloodshed would continue to play out on Chicago's streets. For example, in September 1988, the original founder of the Blackstone Nations, Eugene Bull Hairston, would be killed execution style, with authorities certain that it was Jeff Fort that had handed down the orders from prison. But even more shocking than the allegations of drug trafficking and murder for hire were earlier accusations leveled at Jeff Fort relating to terrorism and linking him to Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. Apparently, over the course of several phone calls made to his troops from jail, Jeff Fort instructed members of his organization to meet officials from Libya in what was originally proposed as a pilgrimage to Mecca and the Middle East, was later exposed as an attempt to make a multi-million-dollar deal with Middle Eastern terrorists, as apparently Jeff Fort had directed El Rukn members to meet with Libyans in Panama City and brokering a deal to receive $2.5 million and a large cache of high-powered weaponry in exchange for a commitment to wage war on the local authorities in the United States in what was described as Operation Rukn. A court was later told that Jeff Fort's religion organization / gang had made an agreement with a foreign government to commit terrorist acts in the United States on their behalf in exchange for a $2.5 million bag. Honestly, this is one of the most outrageous and shocking accusations that has ever been leveled at a gang leader in the United States history. Fort would be found guilty of these accusations and ultimately given a hefty 80-year prison sentence. Jeff Fort is still alive to this day, serving out that sentence at the ADX Florence Supermax prison, one of America's most secure and brutal prison facilities. Jeff Fort's family still fight for his release to this day, but just considering the insane amount of danger and terror he was able to inflict on the Chicago community, and considering what he and his organization were attempting to do in cooperation with a foreign government, it's very hard to believe that his release will be coming anytime soon. The history of Jeff Fort and the Black P-Stones continue to cast a dark shadow over Chicago communities to this day, as the next generation of children of P-Stone and affiliated gang members would move around Chicago and grow up. The identity of the Black P-Stones would be passed around, splintered and distorted, with numerous small organizations breaking off off, but retaining the Peace Stone identity and remaining active in the streets and prisons of Chicago and America beyond. But eventually, a renegade set descending from the original Peace Stones would emerge based on Chicago's east side. This group would eventually go by the name No Limit, with the name apparently signaling a heritage handed down from the Black Peace Stones, but with no interest in following the rules or limits imposed by some of the more militant forefathers of the gang back in the day when it was a religious or political movement. The young orphans of Jeff Fort's fallen organization would grow up and cultivate their own identities and feuds, which would get very deadly indeed. Violence would continue to play out all over Chicago, particularly one small area of territory in the east, which would eventually become so dangerous that it would earn itself the nickname Terrortown. Today's story is most concerned with a 4-block by 4-block rectangle of territory bounded by Yates and Koufax Avenues between 75th and 79th Street. If you type Terrortown into YouTube, you'll see numerous drive-thrus and drone shots depicting the rundown blocks of the area, which looks to be near abandoned by city authorities. And residents say that in these areas, murder is a common occurrence. In the 90s, after the incarceration of Jeff Fort, his son Antonio was one of many descendants of the original Peace Stones who fought for control of this area, with the battles taking place on the streets there apparently being so deadly and terrifying that the area would eventually become known as Terrortown. And naturally, with the infamy of his famous father, it wouldn't take long for Antonio Fort to find himself a target. In 1992, Antonio Fort would be jailed for conspiracy to purchase half a kilo of cocaine, and after his release, power struggles would continue in the area. Events would unfold unfortunately for Antonio, and on the 28th of March 1997, Antonio's bullet-riddled body would be dragged out of Wolf Lake. And in the decade that followed, petty violence would play out as more and more gangsters vied for control of the streets of Terrortown. And if the rival gangs didn't get you, the police certainly would. As the years went by, slowly descendants of Jeff Fort would be taken off the street one by one, facing arrest after arrest, with his other son Wakita picked up for drug charges by the police in 1996, with reports around this time explaining that since Jeff Fort's lengthy incarceration in a supermax facility, the religious focus of the Rukn that he had started had fallen away, with his remaining descendants reclaiming the Black Peace Stone identity and going to war with other famous Chicago gangs like the Gangster Disciples over control of the area. During these years, a nephew of Jeff Fort named Eric Gotherow earned himself the nickname the Prince of Terrortown, apparently establishing a huge open-air drug operation at 79th and Essex known as the Pow Wow Line, a scene which I imagine wasn't dissimilar to the fictional open-air drug market Amsterdam depicted in HBO's The Wire. But eventually, this $15,000 a day drug operation would indeed be taken down too in what the police described as Operation Terrortown 2. Jeff Fort's nephew would be busted along with 18 other people in a raid that discovered an enormous shrine to Jeff Fort himself, along with 13 cars, 10 guns, 125 grams of cocaine, and a whopping 900 grams of heroin. And as a result, the gangs on the streets of Terrortown in the 2010s would be left without leadership, becoming a much more fractured collection of renegade Peace Stone gang sets, slowly losing their connection to Jeff Fort, the Blackstone Rangers, or the heritage of politically motivated gangs that had once controlled the area. Teenage gangbangers would grow up, knowing they descended from Peace Stones, but establishing new rules, new territories, and new disputes, with the young teenagers in the area giving very little thought to the religious, political, or social movements that Jeff Fort had at least tried to pioneer through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But more interesting than that to me was that in the streets and blocks of Terrortown were the next generation of young men growing up close to the cycle of violence and gang warfare that their elders had endured, with some taking part in the war, killing and being killed as part of a new generation of conflict in the streets of Terrortown, while others would take the scenes that they had experienced and witnessed and channeling those experiences into music, making hit songs about the lifestyle that they'd grew up around, becoming successful musical artists and getting a once-in-a-lifetime shot to escape the cycle of violence and get out of the city with their lives intact.